Good morning or good evening, everyone. Thank you to all of you for viewing this forum on MPV's YouTube or Facebook page. Thank you to our partners, Tahirih Justice Center here in the United States and Liberal-Islamischen Bund, or the Liberal Muslims Association in Germany. And a special thanks to our financial sponsor, Urgent Action Fund, which has made this event possible. For many years, we've been addressing this issue of child marriage and forced marriages as an issue over there, meaning in the global South. However, the issue is right here in our backyard in the United States and even in the democratic societies of the West. The issue of child forced marriages go under the radar, either unattended or swept under the rug as a cultural or quote-unquote religious issue. And sometimes the response is even, that is an issue that you need to sort out within your communities through your religious authorities. To address this issue at the United Nations, we use the Universal Periodic Review to file shadow reports on child and forced marriages, whether it's in Muslim-majority countries or countries in the West. In the case of the Netherlands, we filed a shadow report specifically addressing the issue of protecting children in the case of child forced marriages. According to the Quran, marriage is a contract between two consenting adults of sound mind. So in order for anyone to enter into a marriage contract, you have to negotiate that. And so a child is not eligible for that, and a forced marriage is definitely not consensual. So why are child or forced marriages still happening in Muslim societies, not in Muslim-majority countries, but also here in the West? Even in societies where marriage is set at the age of 18, you still see child marriage taking place, and you still see corrupt religious leaders administering these unlawful marriages. Through the advocacy of raising the marriage age to 18 in the United States, there is also a blind spot when it comes to forced marriages of LGBTQI children and adults. As an organization that works at the intersection of many different issues, this is a glaring omission, and it is a missed opportunity to bring on board LGBTQI rights organizations as partners on this issue. To share a story, once I got a call from an adult gay man who consulted me about wanting to do a fake marriage to a lesbian friend so that he would not have to be married off to a straight woman. He was traumatized by this cultural and harmful norm, and all this pressure from his family and his community, and who have threatened him to basically to disown him. He knows that because of the way that he was raised as an Orthodox Muslim. It's important to understand unjust and discriminating interpretation of religion, and in this case, as a Muslim organization in Islam. We will go into the nuances, the intersectionality of the issues with our speakers. But first, before we dive deep, let me take care of some housekeeping matters. You can post your questions or comments on the Facebook page under the streaming posts on YouTube, and you can do so on the right side of the broadcast. Both comments will go live, and we have our team member Cameron monitoring and feeding me the questions and comments. Given the depth of this topic matter and the experience of our speakers, the program will allow our speakers each 8 to 10 minutes. I will follow up with questions or two for each panelist. Once everyone has had their turn at speaking, we will open the floor to 30 minutes of Q&A, allowing lots of time for each panelist to engage in a conversation amongst themselves and with the audience. Lastly, this conversation will be available online, so do share this event with your colleagues, family, and friends. Sharing is caring, and it is only by caring that we can do away with this injustice of child and forced marriages. The first speaker is Dr. Judy. Dr. Judy Weigand is a physical therapist who works with children from 0 to 21 years old. Married at 13, she is a child marriage survivor, now an advocate, whose testimony in 2018 was instrumental in securing passage of the law that limited marriage to legal adults in Kentucky. Additionally, she has provided written and oral testimony to several other states to limit child marriage. She continues to support other survivors of child marriage and works towards a nationwide reform. As a physical therapist, Judy must motivate her young patients to work through their hurts during difficult treatment sessions and ask the same of herself in her work with Tahirih Justice Center. Judy's happily married now, and she has 5 adult and 5 grandchildren. Welcome, Dr. Judy, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I guess a little disclaimer on that one is we have another grandchild now, so there are a total of 6. Yes, so I guess I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. And as you said, I've been a part of some of the legislation changes that have come about in raising the age of marriage in several states. And then as with myself, I was, again, married at 13. I happened to be, what I say, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I didn't know how to get out of this. I didn't know what to do. So again, as you stated, age and not being able to make that particular, voice on your own. So age does happen to do with that. The person who was also involved was of age, and so in Kentucky law, that would have been considered statutory rape. Then later, when I was pregnant, that it was the community leaders, and community leaders in a small community, small rural community, is more the religious leaders or the elders in the community, not necessarily an elected official. The guidance that was provided to me was that for the guidance in churches and of religion, and I prefer not to name denominations because there's some core fundamental things that are in a lot of denominations that are across the board. But I was advised that I did need to marry, and that I would marry this person. What occurs, and that's been a big point of mine, is that when you marry at that age, you're not old enough to work. You really can't get a job because there are child labor laws. So if you can't work, then you don't have money to get to school, which I tried to go back to school. I was not allowed on the school bus. I didn't have child care. No one would help me. I had no one helping me with that. But I was not old enough to drive, so I couldn't get a driver's license even if I could afford to get a car. So there were a lot of constraints that were there, whether they were well thought out or not. Later, especially when you put in this situation, when you have a younger person that's married to someone who is not held under these kind of restrictions, it also restricts you in other ways. To some degree, I sort of felt like I was in prison and he was a warden. It was more of I had to consult, ask permission, that sort of thing, as far as communication with other people or family members and that sort of thing. We also had various living arrangements, and there were times that we did live in homes that had no electricity, no running water, none of the amenities that one would think that is just something that is in this day and age, it's there. But I think when we're talking about the LGBTQ population, this is where I kind of like, let's say, being different. In my experience as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, when the baby was born, I had then no peers. The people who were my age really did not identify with me anymore because I was a married woman. And the older adult females that were in the community didn't value or respect my opinion because I was such a young mother. So I fell in the middle where I really didn't have anybody that I could actually converse with or have friendships or collaborate with, just to be able to have those discussions. So I didn't feel like I fit anywhere. In the rural communities, religion, of course, is more, it's, as I assume with any religion, I can only speak to what I know, that it's something that you begin at birth. So it's taught to you from day one. And a lot of those things are in various denominations, right to life, or the pro-choice marriage, the pro-marriage. Then there's also like no alcohol, no swearing. You must be present in church, and those are just normal things within the community. The question for me comes into place when I'm thinking of those particular things are, so with religion and with a Christian religion, that you do those things. You show up, you go to church, you are that person, you follow the rules that they created, and you're a good church member. But now you insert LGBTQ, and all at once you're ostracized when you're following the same rules that were given to all the others. And the only difference now is just that they know one of those additional facts, but you're still the church member by the rules that they created. And it's of no fault of their own. I do know that church typically believes that if you have enough faith, if you believe strong enough that you can change, you can pray enough, and that you can change. But when I think of those things too, that children, Jesus loves all the little children. He didn't say except for a few. These are all of the people that he has created. The part that I struggle with a little is just whereas there is human decency, where do we, as a community, and as those of us who, if we think in advance of with human decency, if you see a person who is struggling, you try to help. Somebody's home has maybe was burned, then you try to help. And it's human decency. And I think from religion, as I see, that that's the part I don't want to lose sight of. I want to be a good person and to have human decency to anybody who needs any assistance from me, and then be accepting of people. I understand as I go back to not knowing where I belonged. Again, as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, I had no peers. It was a very lonely existence during that time.
It's heartbreaking, and I'm very sorry that you had to endure such loneliness and such hardship. And I think further down in the discussion, when we as a group, as panelists discuss, well, we can talk about the intersectionality, about the role of religion, and how can we use the language of religion that is caring and sharing, and caring about in the Christian tradition about the teachings of Jesus, which is also the teachings in Islam as well. So we can have a common understanding and purpose collectively. Our next speaker is Odette. Odette is a partner of Alliance of Inclusive Muslim, which is our umbrella human rights organization. And Odette Yilmaz, pronounced she, her, is a resident in Hamburg, Germany, and has been a member of the LiB, which is the Liberal Association of Islam in Germany, since 2011, engaged as an activist for women's rights, gender equality, and an inclusive society, and against any kind of group focus and enmity. Since her election as chairperson of LiB in 2018, she has been defending inclusive and progressive values in the context of Islam in several committees and federal ministries. In her main job, she is head of administration at Mamalis, a Hamburg-based institution granting and empowering safe space and education opportunities for refugee women and their children. Welcome, Odette. Thank you for being a panelist.
Thank you for having me here. I'm glad to meet you all. And well, it's not that easy to come to a rather dry topic after what we heard from Judy. I have a lot of respect for what you went through and the strength and power you got out of it with. I'm going to talk about the situation in Germany. I think we have, in the meanwhile, we have a really strict legal situation when it comes to child marriage, at least. According to the Central Register of Foreigners in 2016, which is already 5 years ago, there were around 1,500 minors in Germany that were married. So in child marriage at below 18. We see a little problem here already because this refers to foreigners only. It doesn't pay attention to German citizens in these statistics. And we like an official statistic of German citizens being captured or held in child or forced marriage, unfortunately. In 2016, we had a major change in the law, which was basically due to the so-called refugee crisis in 2015-16, where a law to fight child marriage was established and enacted, which is, I think, one of the strictest laws we have internationally. It's even stricter than laws we have in the surrounding countries like Austria or Switzerland. By this law, any marriage, wherever it has been established, where one of the partners is a minor below 16 years, is considered void by law. So it's like when someone gets to Germany and they have been married in a different country below the age of 16, however this marriage had been established, is going to be considered void. This is a legal problem because it doesn't distinguish in this case between child and forced marriage. Of course, in our understanding, this goes hand in hand. But this law, in the first place, has to prevent further child marriages from happening. And it needs to be considered in individual cases for existing marriages. This is something our Constitutional Court is dealing with currently because this law as it is, in some cases, might go against our Constitution because it can cause undue hardships for minor partners in these already existing marriages too, because families might be torn apart because in some of these marriages, there are already children, or mostly the female part of these marriages is at risk of losing their residence permit and similar problems. And it applies not only to marriages where one of the partners is still a minor, but for example, if there is a couple coming here and they're both like in their 30s, but their marriage had been established abroad below the age of 16, this marriage is still considered void. So this is a bit tricky, which the part of the law that is a bit clearer and easier is for those where one of the partners is 16 or 17 years old at the time of the establishment of the marriage. There is a choice. Like when the partners come of age, they can agree to maintain the marriage or to dissolve it. Another thing that is pretty relevant but still difficult is that this law prohibits any kind of social marriage, so-called social marriage, which would be established by cultural or religious ceremonies, but mostly below the radar of public authorities and without involvement of the civil law. The intention of this law is good, and we see where it is going, but there are still some gaps and question marks we have to work on, which will be a point I will address as a core topic for me and for our association, maybe our whole society, to work on in the future, because there is so much we are just not aware of. Like, as I already said, the statistics about child marriage only refer to foreigners, but the statistics of information centers or shelters, they tell a different story. They tell a story of about 40 to 50% of those seeking counsel from them, like those being captured in child marriages and forced marriages, being German citizens. You might ask, how can that be when it's prohibited in Germany? But it's kind of easy. Something that I must admit happened to me myself when I was 16. Is you go on vacation with your family abroad, see your family in a different country, and you get under some kind of huge pressure and are talked into a marriage that you don't want to get your cousin or whoever to the country you're living in. This is something that is still going on. And of course, the law has made it much more difficult to have these kinds of marriages acknowledged in Germany, but we shouldn't underestimate the pressure that is still ongoing, because the mere legal opportunity to leave these relationships, these marriages, might not be enough, because those concerned are still living with the fear of losing their dear ones, of losing their families when they take this step. They might even have a fear of endangering their families, like especially in cultures where a wedding goes with a significant dowry. Like, for example, in the Sinti and Romani communities, the bridal side pays a relevant amount when their daughters get married, and they do so at a very young age. I know of weddings that have taken place where both bride and groom were like between 13 and 15 years old. So, taking the step out of this marriage and to an information center, to a shelter, to a lawyer or to court, takes a lot of courage, and often they don't want to be responsible for the, let's call it bankruptcy of the whole family and ruining chances for the siblings or whatever. So there's a huge social pressure going with it, where we really need departments and authorities responsible for children's well-being to have an eye on it. And to be honest, the last 1.5, 2 years didn't make it easier, because the lockdowns that we were going through made it much easier to keep those kinds of social marriages that are illegal but barely recognized. It made it so much easier to keep it below the radar. And like normally you would have some institutions having an eye on it, like schools that would realize or that would notice when girls or boys won't come to school anymore because maybe something happened, and they would pose questions. And when there's a lockdown, the schools are closed, and there is no social contact, no real life social contact. It's so much easier to hide these situations. And I really fear that we will have a lot to work on when the situation gets calmer again. And addressing the topic of LGBTQIA plus people, of course, we see it here too. There are no official statistics, at least not reliable ones. But of course, from my activities in the LiB, I know some stories. People come and seek for counsel, seek for help, or just someone to talk to they can trust. And there are a story of a lesbian woman that came up to me, stayed in my mind for quite a while, because she knew very early that she wasn't straight, and her family obviously had an idea of it too. And she got married at the age of 16, and of course by force. And she tried to escape this marriage. Like she took steps to information centers, to shelters, because she was suffering violence from her husband too, because of course, like he would notice too. And the end was that like I really want to keep it short, because I'm not entitled to tell too many personal details of the story, but the end was that she was suffering huge depressions and drowned it in alcohol, and she is still struggling and suffering and still not seeing a way out. So we have to empower authorities and departments for women, for youth, whatever, to help those people in a way that they are really protected. And there are, of course, recommendments by the federal ministries too, like to make sure that people trying to get out of this kind of marriage are protected, taken to a different city as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, to get away from the situation. But still there is this this hesitation, because they don't want to lose their families. And I think also from my experience, even we should even have an eye on medical departments when it comes to psychotherapy or psychological support, because these people have to be strengthened, have to be empowered too, and to find the courage to realize that they have a right to be happy, no matter what their families say, no matter what their social environment might say. But yeah, sometimes the fear is bigger than the desire to be happy. And this is something I want to address. Like we need an intersectional project or whatever to end this situation too. Like it's not only the prevention, it's also helping people out that are already in it, and see all the obstacles they're coming across on their way out. Because I know it's not easy. Thank God I had a very supportive family and a very supportive father who got me out himself. But that's the case for a very, very small minority, I fear. So what I would wish for the future, if I may address this, as I say, would be such an intersectional project with experts from several subjects like medical care, children's welfare, ministries wherever necessary and possible, and reliable statistics. Like we have to do a reliable research with educational institutions like universities or whatever, and the information centers, so we are able to get funds to create the projects we need to help those people so far.
Oh, thank you, Odette. And I am also very sorry that you had to go through your child marriage experiences as well. And thank goodness you had a supportive father. I have a short question for you that in the shelters in Germany, are you not allowed to go to domestic violence shelters if you are under 18?
Of course you are. There are separate shelters for girls and for adult women. But the step of going there is very hard because this means no contact, like to anyone, because they have protected addresses, of course, and it means no contact to your friends, no contact to your sisters, to your parents or whoever. And when you are still a minor, I think this is a huge step to take.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this is something that we can address collectively, the comparisons between Europe or Germany in particular. I don't know how it is in the rest of the EU, but the issues that we have here in the United States. Our next speaker is a longtime old friend of mine, El Farouk Khaki. He, him, is an intersectional human rights and dignity activist, public speaker, writer, author, and a lots more. And I told him, when you send the bio, please don't send me a book. and he did not send me a book. So that is very helpful. But El Farouk is also a member of our umbrella organization, Alliance of Inclusive Muslims. He is also a media commentator on Islam, LGBTQ/human rights, refugees, politics, and racism, HIV issues. He's queer parenting. He has a son. He is a lawyer whose practice since 1993 focuses on refugee claims based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, HIV. He is co-owner of the Glad Day Bookshop, the world's oldest LGBTQIA bookshop there in Toronto. Welcome, El Farouk.
Thank you. My bio, I think I did a word count, was like 220, and I had a limit of 250. So I thought I did really well on that. So salams, everybody. Juma Mubarak. My name is El Farouk. I go by he, him pronouns, and I am in Toronto, Canada, in the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. I'm honored and humbled to be here on this panel. And I want to thank Judy and Odette for sharing their stories. I come to this topic from a variety of different angles. As I started Salam Queer Muslim Community, back then a social support group for lesbian and gay Muslims back in 1991. And I am the co-founder and I serve as Imam of the unit of El Tawhid Jummah Circle, the Unity Mosque. So I come to information around child and forced marriage through my community activism and community building. And I also come to it through my work as a refugee lawyer. As a gay man, of course, I'm particularly sensitive, or I'd like to think I'm particularly sensitive to LGBTIQ2S populations and how they fit into this larger narrative. And I want to point out that while we're talking also about child forced marriage, that forced marriage takes place across the spectrum, across all religions, all nationalities, all cultures, and all age groups. Because as Odette pointed out, there are things that happen like, let's go for a holiday, let's go to your cousin's wedding, and we won't tell you that it's also going to be your wedding. But there are also means of coercion of older people, especially in more traditional cultures or societies where there's an expectation of marriage by a particular age. And so the nature of the violence, sometimes when people think of forcing somebody or something, that it is necessarily physical, but in fact it is an intersectional form of violence because it occurs at the social, spiritual, religious, family and family levels and every other level that you can think of, because it goes to your core. Pray the gay away. The notion of like lesbian women deal with, for example, in many societies, with the corrective rape, that forced violent so-called sex will somehow convert a lesbian or queer woman into heterosexuality, that a heterosexual marriage will just magic mushroom somebody into heterosexuality as well. And this form of denial of people's identities and realities is a form of abuse and is a form of violence. And it then manifests at every level in terms of how people are treated and how people function. In terms of the Canadian system and the Canadian context, the legal age of marriage is 18, but under some circumstances, it can be as young as 15. What I was reading the other day is that over the years, in this century anyway, the numbers of formal marriage of underage folks has declined, but there has been an increase in informal marriage, i.e. common law relationships. And while in most jurisdictions in Canada, common law relationships have many rights and protections, it's also harder to establish, especially if you're underage. And one of the things that I am aware of, some of the stories that have come to me in my community activism, is people being forced to go back, either through some nature of coercion, or to be told we're going for a family reunification or a family wedding or so on and so forth, and then all of a sudden their passports are taken away or they're not allowed to leave. I've also heard of instances where, particularly with refugees or people who have family overseas, that, oh, we've forgiven you and your father is really sick, you need to come, or this is happening and you need to come, and they go back thinking that there's some reconciliation, or that they're saying goodbye to somebody that they care about, and instead they're saying goodbye to their own authenticity, because then they're stuck there. The other population that I deal with is are refugees, and my refugee stream is, first of all, a gendered stream. So the majority of my clients are women or women-identified people. And many of them are fleeing domestic violence or gendered violence situations. A lot of those women are also queer women, lesbian, bisexual, trans women, who have been forced into marriage because that's the social and cultural. And they might have been forced into marriage even not within the context of LGBT, but in many cases in that context. I want to share a story with you of one of my clients, a Muslim woman from East Africa, from a country that is not majority Muslim. And I have a lot of clients from this country, and I can tell you that the issues that I see in the Muslim population are also the same issues that I see in every other population. But she was in my office, and we were working on redacting her story as to what happened to her that eventually caused her to flee and come to Canada to seek refugee protection, or as Americans call it, asylum. So her story, she's lesbian. She was found out to be a lesbian. She was beaten up by her father and then forced into a marriage with an abusive spouse. She eventually escaped that marriage and found her way to Canada. But what she carried with her is this internalized sense that she was a bad Muslim and a bad daughter because she had disobeyed her father. And good Muslim children are supposed to listen to their parents. So Ani, you talked about how we need to use religion. So I looked at her and I said, well, in Islam, children are an amana, they're a trust. They're not the possessions of their parents. And a parent is supposed to treat their trust to make them thrive. Instead, your father abused you and then forced you into a marriage where he knew you were going to also be abused physically and sexually. So actually, he failed. And I use the story of Abraham in the Quran, where in the Quranic story, God tells Abraham, respect your father who is an idolater, but don't follow his ways. Right? So respect your family, respect your culture and your tradition, but know that your culture and your tradition is not, number one, monolithic, and number two, the protection of life is primary, not the protection of some kind of family honor or family shame. But there's a whole lot of unlearning that has to go through for the survivors of this kind of insipid forms of abuse and violence. So the way forward are more conversations like this, more globalized networks to see how different forms of violence manifest in across the board and that are still perpetuated today. Like abuse and violence are recycled. They don't just go away. They manifest differently. And, you know, Odette, you made the reference to COVID and its impact. And this is one of the documents that I enter in my refugee claims, which is that human rights abuses and violations have been often exacerbated in many places because of COVID-19. And I'm not talking about masking and vaxxing and stuff like that. I'm talking on the ground level, how political opponents are, you know, charged under laws, but also how people who are abused, women who are abused, or LGBT folks who can't get away from spaces are stuck within their spaces of abuse and violence. I'll stop there. I think I've done my 8 or so minutes. But I do see an intersectional approach is absolutely vital, because I think it's really important to dissect what abuse and what coercion and what forced looks like in different cultures, in different spaces, and in different places. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Well, when we talk later on as a group, we can discuss about what the Canadian laws are. I think you addressed the sort of the under the radar sort of marriages that's happening. But to move on, Casey Swegman is a partner of Muslims for Progressive Values, and Tahirih Justice Center has been a partner with MPV for a long time in our efforts together in addressing child forced marriages here in the United States under an umbrella organization. Casey Swegman is a nationally recognized expert on the issue of forced and child marriage in the United States. As the Forced Marriage Initiative Project and Policy Manager, Casey provides direct social services to individuals facing forced marriages, fields technical assistance requests nationally, leads Tahirih state and federal policy advocacy on forced and child marriage, and chairs the National Forced Marriage Working Group. Casey was the principal content drafter and developer of the Forced Marriage Initiative website and service provider toolkit, and she engages in extensive domestic and international outreach and training on this issue. She also serves as a liaison to agencies and service providers looking to increase the capacity of the local community to respond to cases of forced marriage, and has been featured as an expert on forced marriage at seminars and panel discussions in the US and internationally. I welcome Casey.
Well, thank you, Ani. And I just want to say, after Farouk's comments, I was like, mic drop, this is done. You've said all the things that I really wanted to say. You understood the assignment, as the kids say these days. And really, I hope that we can continue to collaborate in this space as well. Also, obviously, really need to just thank Dr. Judy Weigand and Odette for showing up today at all the time zones we are in and sharing your stories. I know it is never easy and never without personal cost to share those personal stories and to continue to advocate in these spaces. So huge gratitude for you, and to Ani, obviously, for bringing us all together. You know, I'm here to give closing remarks, and I think I just want to say, first off, that everything that everyone has shared today is echoing exactly what Tahirih sees in our casework across the country every single day with the survivors that we work with, of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all religious faiths. The Tahirih Justice Center works with immigrant survivors of gender-based violence seeking asylum, as well as, you know, multi-generational Americans from across the country facing forced and child marriage. And so what I think I really want people to take away from today's presentation is that broad point that forced and child marriage is impacting individuals from all walks of life. It is a global problem, and places like the United States, Canada, and Germany are a part of that globe. We are not exceptional in that way. And when something so vital as an individual's identity as their faith is used as a form of power and control in an effort to force someone to be forced into a marriage, is incredibly harmful. And when that forced marriage is then also an attempt not only to enforce these strict sort of traditional gender norms, but also to, quote unquote, correct or alter someone's fundamental sexual or gender identity, that harm and that trauma is further compounded because that's an attack on their humanity. And these harms really have to be recognized, and these layered traumas really have to be tended to uniquely. We have to pay attention to that. And as Ani said at the beginning of this, we as a movement, at least in the United States, we need to do a better job at working in partnership with our allies in the LGBTQIA movement to address all the ways in which forced and child marriage is impacting people across the US, and that survivors especially receive that holistic support, and in particular those community connections that they're going to need to thrive after the fact. And when it comes to faith and faith-based abuse, I want to remind everyone that it really is our job as advocates and as service providers to remind folks all the time that no religion sanctions or promotes forced and child marriage. And for those survivors to whom faith is really important and really essential to their identity, it's important to continuously empower them to feel that their religion has their back. In fact, their religion is protective of them in all the ways that the other panelists have already shared today. Many of the survivors we work with remain religious after their experience of trauma because of the ways in which religion should be empowering and can be really essential to healing. And so it is our job as service providers to help them remember that and to make faith something that is an experience of healing and empowerment and of love. And with that, I will turn it back to Ani to get us started with open dialogue. I can't say anything any better than other people already have, but I think our role as service providers and advocates is clear. Our mandate and our call to action is also quite clear. So thank you again to all the rest of the panelists, and Ani, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Casey. I want to circle back to Dr. Judy, because given the context from which you were forced into marriage and how the religious authorities within your particular community do not support your wellness in this regard, since you have successfully, or I could say, like Odette was saying, right to be happy, and I'm assuming you are now happy. How has the religious community come to terms with that, with your situation, and how you've come out of it in the way that you have as an advocate, even, and respectfully too, to not demonize them, which I think is very important.
At this point, and there came a point in my life where, still remaining as a Christian person, that I have made changes as far as my beliefs and my feelings and my Christianity aligns more with the Catholic faith. So I myself have gone into the Catholic faith, and that's been quite a while. I've been part of the Catholicism for maybe 25 years. I don't disbelieve in my faith. And as you said, I guess maybe more so, I believe more in my faith. I think that sometimes, well, no, in my particular case, being a small fundamentalist area, that sometimes when like El Farouk was saying, is that sometimes when those are lined up, that it's sort of left up to somebody else's interpretation of what that says. And that's a person's interpretation. That's not the interpretation of what the religious context actually is. So I had to come to terms with that myself, that this was somebody else's interpretation of what they thought it was, and being that I was younger, I really didn't know how else to interpret it. But no, I'm still a part of my religion, and even more so, I guess it's again the interpretation somebody else had.
I invite everyone to turn their microphone on if you want, just to jump in this conversation. The intersectionality of all the faiths in this regard, and obviously, faith is two-pronged. We deal with this issue on so many different levels as MPV and as a member of AIM, where you have religion being used and abused to justify violence. And sadly, this happens, the most hurtful form of violence is within the family unit. When your own parent sometimes is the abuser, it is detrimental, very harmful to the child. I want to share a story of a young woman, and Farouk, you talked about forced marriage being at all ages. In some Muslim societies, you have cultures, you have these arranged marriages. Now, arranged marriages most of the time are consensual of two adults, but there are times when, in this particular case that I'm sharing, is a story about a woman who is born and raised in the United States and in New York, and she's in her last school in medical school, and she went through the process of arranged marriage by her parents, but she concluded she did not want to go through with this marriage, but her parents would not have it. And so she was forced into marriage against her own will. This is an adult woman in the United States in her last year of medical school. So as a result of that, she went to a psychologist and started taking antidepressants. I mean, spiraled down in this very harmful path that was so unnecessary and so unhealthy. And it is sad that the parents themselves don't see the harm that they've caused to this otherwise wonderful and successful child that they have raised. So anyway, so that's like a bit of the story that I get as, representative of Muslims for Progressive Values. But I'd like to open it up to, let's just have a conversation here. Farouk, you want to touch on your attachment to the Abraham, the prophet, was spot on, and I'm sure some folks were not too happy about hearing that, or will not be happy about hearing that, but.
Well, a lot of folks wouldn't be too happy to hear a lot of my theology around Abraham and all of that. But, I think that's the way of reframing religion out of a patriarchal, heteronormative context, I think is a challenge across the religious spectrum, and certainly within the Muslim community. And our work, whether it's through MPV or through LiB or through the Unity Mosque or through AIM, is to actually make the connections between these different forms of abuse and violence. And also, I think it's really important to allow people to think outside of their box. A lot of my clients have, even the ones who've been, or folks that I've encountered who've even been raised here, is the imagination of what is possible is so limited because of circumstance and community and social circumstance and economics in many cases, and social access, particularly for women, that the capacity, one of the board members of the refugee board has been asking my clients in their hearings, what was their reaction when they first heard that two men or two women could marry in Canada. Right. And it's that capacity to think outside of your limitation. I tell my clients, what is the normal that you want? And I think that's something that all of us need to ask. What is the normal that you want? And how do you get there? Because what we have been often told, and that's all of us across the board, that what is normal or what should be normal is not necessarily what's healthiest for us. Right. And I think religion has become this double-edged sword where it has been used or continues to be used to deny the full humanity and the full human agency certain kinds of people, women and queer folk and trans folk in particular. So I look forward to those conversations as to how we can dissect. And from a Muslim perspective, if I can say, you know, it's really easy for us as Muslims to also latch on to what our siblings from other faith traditions have already begun to develop, particularly within Christian and Jewish traditions. So mutual cross-pollination.
Yeah. And Ani, if I can chime in just with a little, maybe a message of hope to latch on to sort of the work that Farouk is doing in Canada, there is certainly pushback from religious groups when we go to change minimum age of marriage laws. And that is one of the conversations that Judy is expert at having, is with religious leaders who are using religious justifications to maintain lower ages of marriage in certain circumstances. But there is also a movement from religious leaders to support ending child marriage in the United States. And in particular, in the state of Maryland, we had the archdiocese and Catholic bishops come out and speak publicly and testify in support of our bill, saying that they can see no reason why they would want anyone under the age of 18 to be entering into a marriage for any reason whatsoever. And they were able to quote canon law. And when certain legislators who felt they knew the Bible better than he did, they found themselves sorely mistaken. And so that was a really precious moment for all of us in the movement, to see that person come forward time and time again. The bill has been introduced in Maryland several times, and they haven't backed down. And they have really wonderful reasoning as to why they stand in support of us. And religious leaders have come forward in other states as well. And so for me, it's really important that folks in this space who might be toying with the idea of saying, I'd really like to be in solidarity with this movement, but I'm just not sure what my faith group would think of me, or if I would be safe doing so and be able to keep my community. You wouldn't be the first. There are others who have gone before you. You would not be standing alone. There are certainly people who are standing up and saying you can be both a Christian or a Catholic or whatever the case may be, and support the rights of children and supports the rights of folks to choose for themselves whether, when, and who they marry.
There is a question that we're going to address in a minute, but I want to ask you, Casey, real quick. But do we have anything on the Tahirih Justice Center website that has the canon law and all the different faith laws that would deter or that discourages, that prohibits child forced marriage? That maybe that's something that we can work together in partnership with others if there isn't one.
That's a great question, and it is something that we do not have yet. We lean heavily on our partners who are more expert in that space around faith-based abuse and are coming to their work as advocates for survivors of gender-based violence, but from a faith-based perspective. So in the US, I'll say, in terms of materials for Muslim survivors who are hoping to sort of do similar interrogation as El Farouk has sort of outlined in his work, Peaceful Families Project and Karama are great resources. But I think, we do have a recording of that Catholic priest coming forward in Maryland, and could certainly be the basis of a resource. And I think a clearinghouse of resources or a library of resources for different faith backgrounds of folks who can see the ways in which their faith is protective of them and supportive of them, and the resources that they can go to find community would be a great idea.
I wanted to add just one little tidbit of information with mine also too, is that before my husband and I were married, I went to the Catholic Church to ask for an annulment, and they told me I did not need one. There was another process we went through. They said that I did not need one because they would have never approved that marriage anyway.
There we go. But that's something that we can all work on collectively. If anything, that might be something of urgent need to advance the work of the religious, to deter the religious justification for it. The question that we have is this, and anyone can jump in and answer, address it. For a future hospital chaplain, does anyone have any comments about how this topic is relevant for that position, or what they could do in that position? for someone in a chaplaincy position?
I'm going to jump into that one, and I'm going to plug the Mantle of Mercy. And as part of my disclosure, I was enrolled in a master's in pastoral studies that would have fed me into the chaplaincy stream had I finished it a few years ago. And it was a Muslim chaplaincy stream at a United Church institution at the University of Toronto. And this past year, I was asked to write a chapter in a book that's coming out called The Mantle of Mercy. It's a book on Islamic chaplaincy with a variety of different topics dealing with Islamic chaplaincy and the issues that come up. So around gender issues and violence and all sorts of stuff. They asked me to write a chapter on Muslim chaplaincy and LGBTIQ people. And I believe that if I recall looking at the index, there are a number of chapters dealing with a variety of different gender issues. I don't know whether forced marriage is, and that also is a misnomer because it's not always one particular gender. But I do suggest that you look for resources like that in terms of for guidance on dealing with diverse populations. And I think this is going to be one of those resource guides. It's coming out in January of 2022, and I believe it's Templeton University Press. So maybe if you're interested, watch out in that. It's difficult a lot of times when people are are living in forced or coerced marriage type situations. If you end up at the hospital, the person may not have language skills or even the freedom to actually articulate their circumstances, and they may not have the imagination to actually articulate that what they're experiencing is something that should not happen. And that again comes back into unlearning our oppressions as well. And so I think that my advocacy, I live in Toronto, so Toronto is this really sort of diverse city. So a lot of non-LGBTIQ organizations and spaces and so on will have affirming policies. They will have stuff that you can clearly see that they're allies and so on. But I think that kind of stuff needs to happen. Information needs to be easily accessible to people in a variety of spaces for them to unlearn and know that necessarily to be able to actually think outside their own box and recognize that there is space outside of that box for them as well.
On the point of chaplaincy, MPV has also started endorsing chaplains here in the United States, but obviously our endorsement is based on our progressive values and which is very different than the traditional and Orthodox institutions here in America, Muslim institutions here in America, which I would compare them to be more like Orthodox Judaism in their practice. And I wanted to actually go to Odette and see if there's there is this initiative there in Germany about training German religious leaders in German at the university level, and if it would also address some of these issues that we're discussing.
I don't really have details in mind about the curriculum. I think it's quite possible that it's addressed, but besides that, there are already Muslim chaplaincies in Germany too, like recently established basically in the past 2, 3, 4 years. And we too are about to establish a known chaplaincy system, which will be mostly digital due to our structure, of course, because we too found that the Muslim chaplaincies that we have here are based on but conservative values, and some topics just fall off the rim, so we try to add to it with progressive and liberal views too. For the university, I can't tell because is in Germany, due to our constitution, this is a very ambivalent thing, basically, to which extent they are able to do this in the universities.
Anyone else want to add to that, or to take this conversation to a different level or different direction? By all means, do so.
No, that's always me. To a chaplain, because when I've done work in the hospitals and that sort of thing too, I guess my advice for whatever it's worth, people love each other. I've known of couples, male or female, that they're not allowed in ICU because the marriage wasn't recognized. And if you've been with somebody for a number of years and you love that person, that you should, that is their spouse. Don't exclude them. Keep them the same as my spouse. I mean, if my spouse is in ICU, or, give them the same courtesy, consideration that you would give if it were heterosexual couples.
Yeah.
I will also just add that sometimes our clients come to us through hospital settings, and it is only in that moment of pure isolation, unfortunately, that they are able to disclose what is happening to them, to someone who is wholly unconnected to their family and community. And this is not rare. Oftentimes it is a mental health setting, because they have truly broken down under all of the pressure and all of the abuse. And they will be portrayed as someone who is unstable, who is non-compliant with their treatment or their medications. And when you finally ask the right questions and understand why it is they're feeling the way they're feeling, you might find that lurking behind that is this forced marriage prospect lurking in their future. And I think anyone under that kind of pressure and stress at any age would have a real struggle with mental health. And so I think what I say to all people in healthcare settings is to be prepared to ask the right questions and to respond with empathy and with belief of a survivor if they do disclose something, and to be prepared for that, because I think a lot of folks go into lots of different lines of work thinking that they'll never encounter survivors. And I think anyone who works with people needs to be prepared to encounter survivors and to respond with empathy.
El Farouk, when you are dealing with these cases, what is the Canadian law when it comes to child force marriages of all ages scenario? What is the outcome of your cases?
My cases are mostly accepted. Canada's refugee interpretation has been at the forefront in terms of progressive or inclusive interpretation. So sexual orientation was included as in the interpretation by the Supreme Court way back in 1993. Gender, including FGM, forced marriage, domestic violence, before in the early 1990s, so like 1990, 1991. So we have a long history of that kind of inclusion. And, Judy, before there was legal same-sex marriage in Canada, the Refugee Board was hearing cases of same-sex couples together as they would any other couple. So in general, there's a recognition of the form of coercion as a form of abuse and as a form of violence. Of course, it's all contextual to country and claimant and also board members, because board members are independent decision makers with discretion. And so you can, as with religion, you can look at one thing and arrive with very different conclusions as to what it means and what should happen next. But generally speaking, the coercion of folks of whatever sexuality, sexual orientation, or gender is understood in the decision-making process as being problematic. In Canada, of course, consent is only at age 18 unless you have consent from a parent, and that's where the issue comes up, and under what circumstances and what kind of parents are these that are consenting. And then the flip side of that is what happens in common law relationships, especially in certain jurisdictions. I believe in Quebec that there aren't certain protections that exist in other jurisdictions. So you might not get alimony and support and so on and so forth. So it's somewhat of a mixed bag, and the forced marriages are both immigrant and non-immigrant populations, both Muslim and non-Muslim populations. So in terms of my clients, a lot of them come here, and if they're successful and they get help, they have rose-colored glasses as to how wonderful things are in Canada, but it isn't always that way, right? So, I have folks who say there's no racism here, and I'm like, or, there's no sexism here. I'm like, right? Or I've never experienced homophobia here. I'm like, but it's a question of your location and where you are. And being in downtown Toronto may also be different from being, let's say, in Alberta, and in populations there. So,
Odette, so Germany is also a federation, and so therefore you have different regional laws, if I'm not mistaken. And so how does that also make things complicated in Germany?
The regional laws only apply to certain topics. The topic of marriage is a federal law, so it applies to all of Germany.
Okay, cool. So there is an inquiry. Oh, go ahead, Casey.
I don't know if we've touched on the U.S. landscape. I think it might be pretty obvious to folks, but just for anyone who might be listening or watch this later, it is not set federally. Marriage is the purview of states, and we have a complete sort of potpourri of laws that are scattered all over the map. In this country, we still have 9 states that have no minimum age of marriage at all as set by statute, and only 6 that set a bright line of 18 with no exceptions, and 6 more that set the only exception as emancipated minors who are 16 or 17, endowed with the full legal rights of an adult. And beyond that, you have age floors of 14 in Alaska, 15 in Maryland, and all over the place in terms of if it's parental consent, pregnancy, or judicial approval that allows that marriage to go forward. And so it's a long campaign, it's a state campaign, and it will be a long journey. But I think notably, there was an amazing article that came out of an analysis of how Mexico's journey to outlaw child marriage has gone. And they similarly have states that set the minimum age of marriage. It cannot be done at the federal or national level. And they worked for from 2008 to 2018, it seemed like Mexico took incremental steps towards 16 and then towards 17 in lots of different states. And at this point now, by 2018, 30 of the 32 states had set the minimum age of marriage at 18. And so seeing that incremental approach really work in a place that's very similarly situated to the US gives us a lot of hope that we're on the right track.
For our viewers interested to learn more about that, we have a ticker at the bottom here to go to tahirih.org and /child marriage for more information about the laws and the pockets of states that we still need to work on. Well, is there any other comments and any other questions you want to ask each other? By all means, open the mics.
I wanted to actually comment on the laws, and it's one thing to have laws, and certainly having progressive laws makes our collective work easier. But with laws, there has to be some kind of monitoring and some kind of enforcement, because an unenforced and an unmonitored law actually fosters impunity. A law on the books that is not enforced allows abusers to continue to do so without actual fear. And so we need to also talk about once we change the laws. And I deal with LGBTIQ people people who come from countries where there are anti-gay or anti-LGBT laws on the books. They may or may not be enforced. In those contexts, there is a social environment and a social context of acceptance, of cultural acceptance. So even if the law is not being enforced, it allows abuses to take place. But I think in Western, so-called Western democracies, when you have laws that are not enforced, it actually, you know, if there's a non-smoking sign and everyone smokes underneath, once one person starts smoking, everyone else is going to start smoking, right? So that's sort of a crass comparison, but I really value the notion of enforcement mechanisms once we have these laws as well, because these also are really hard to decipher. It's hard to get that information. It's hard for people to come forward, and so when they do, and if they do come forward, there has to be something that benefits them, as opposed to being mired in a system where they might end up being further abused.
I think it's a common problem that I mean, I officiate a lot of marriages, and sometimes we get requests, obviously, that we decline to do. But I think, you know, the law is one thing, but even then, you know, we have what needs to be worked on is how do we promote a culture within our respective communities where, whether there is a law against child marriage or forced marriages or not, the culture in itself frowns on it and will not allow for it. Because at the end of the day, there are imams or religious authorities that do child forced marriages under the rubric of, you know, religious freedom to practice one religion however they see fit, and regardless of the civil laws of the state or the country in this case. So those are, as an organization, those are the issues that we address. You know, laws is one thing, but laws doesn't necessarily stamp out the human rights abuses and so forth that is being perpetuated in the name of religion. And one perfect example is in Kenya. Marriage for both boys and girls is 18, but in some enclaves, child marriage still persists, and those officiating those marriages are, in the cases that we have to deal with, that we are aware of, and the issues we are addressing, are being conducted by imams. You know, we have child marriage cases in refugee camps in Lebanon, you know, where you have the rich suitor coming in and offering a lot of dowry or meher to the parents. This is also illegal because in the context of Islam, the meher or the dowry is supposed to go to the bride, not to the parents. And so, you know, this becomes like more of a monetary transaction of selling your child off, you know, in this case. And this happens in these summer vacations that happens in Egypt, in Indonesia. So it's quite a rampant issue. And so there's this underlining of how do we address religion in such a way that religion itself is a source of human rights rather than used as, you know, as perpetuating human rights abuses. Any last comments? It's 9:18. Last comments, last question. You want to address each other? By all means, go for it.
The only other thing I'll plug around laws being one thing and needing lots of other community and societal change is the importance of comprehensive sexuality education for young people and empowerment at a very young age, so that we start to change those norms and start to really, at a very young age, help children to understand their rights and to understand that all identities, regardless of where you come from or what you might be hearing where you are beautiful and supported. And I think that's one thing that we're really starting to push in the United States, is whether or not your state is providing comprehensive sexuality education, we should be providing funding for girl-led and community-based comprehensive sexuality education and outreach and programming.
Odette, Dr. Judy Weigand, El Farouk, any last comments to make?
I'll jump in with one. I feel, as I said earlier, that if you, I don't believe there's a religion that would say, shed your human decency. All religions want you to be decent to other human beings. And if we all just kind of would keep that tucked in the back of your mind, then I think you're on, everybody's religion is on board with that one.
Yeah. Odette?
We've been talking a lot about legal conditions and stuff, and to add to this is just that we should bear in mind that law shouldn't be always black and white. We have to shed a light on the individual cases to not harm people more than they already have been harmed. And I think most importantly, dealing with people affected by child forced marriage is treat them on eye level, don't belittle them, don't pity them, empower them, and just stay a strong community, be a strong community. And no matter the religion, no matter the residents, that's what I hope we can do.
And I'm gonna pipe in and talk a little and sort of throw in, white supremacy and how we have to be careful of how laws are used to marginalize immigrant and racialized and post 9/11 Muslim populations around the world, and how when we're talking about laws, what cultural arrogance comes with those laws, and what presumptions come with them, and to make sure that they're not being that certain communities are not disproportionately targeted or impacted by laws that may seem neutral but that are in fact not. And so always on the lookout for how the state can also be the source of othering, especially marginalized populations. And marginalized also means economically marginalized, because we don't carry the big bang of the buck in terms of swaying the discourse. So.
Well, I think Casey will be happy to address that, because we're ahead of the curve when it comes to that in our umbrella organization. Casey, do you want to say a few words about that?
I think El Farouk hit it on the head. We have to recognize that everything that we might do in this space, if you are not from a marginalized community, you need to be centering those folks when you are crafting solutions, because whether you know it or not, likely what you'll do will cause unintended consequences. And that plays into the hands of those who would intend consequences. And we need to be very careful to center the voices of those who are on the margins, because the solutions we craft with them in mind will be the most useful solutions for all of us. And we need, as particularly folks coming from white backgrounds, we need to learn to approach all of these issues and legislation and crafting programs in response to survivors with humility, and taking a step back and listening to those who are most marginalized and impacted. It will benefit all of us. I really can't say it any better than El Farouk said it, but we need to really be talking about that. I'm glad it was named here, and it needs to be on the table when we're talking about solutions.
Well, as part of that umbrella organization to end child forced marriage in the United States, I'm happy to say that we have a lot of minority groups involved, and faith traditions as well. So, in the many conversations that we've had over the years, that is definitely on the radar. So, I'm happy to share that bit. But to conclude, when you were talking about, Casey, about the education piece of sexual education, I'm happy to say that I've co-authored and co-designed a children's curriculum that is rooted in human rights, that is inclusive of LGBT and is very feminist from its prism. So, and I hope that the next generation of Muslims will be much more rooted in human rights in the way they live their lives, and much more inclusive. Anyway, on that note, I think we will end this forum. I thank you all for this very in-depth discussion, and I look forward to taking this conversation to the next level with religious leaders themselves, and to work closer with all of you on this issue, not just here in the United States, but globally as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And until next time, please don't forget to share this conversation with your colleagues, policymakers, friends, and family. Bye-bye.